This story is too terrifying. The best part of this story is the final part. Prologue. The seed of fear. Ethan had always been drawn to the macabre. As a child, his fascination with horror stories was insatiable. He would beg his uncle, a man with a dark sense of humor, to recount tales of ghosts, monsters, and the supernatural. One night, his uncle told him the story of the Shadow Room. The Shadow Room, his uncle began, is a place where shadows come to life. They wait in the darkness, biding their time, hungry for the living. Once you enter, the shadows start to whisper. They know your fears, your secrets, your deepest regrets. And if you stay too long, they consume you. The story was more than just words. It was a vivid recounting, filled with details that etched themselves into Ethan's young mind. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the shadows cast by his nightlight. Were they moving? Were they watching him? The thought terrified him, and from that night on, the shadows in his room seemed to take on a life of their own. Chapter 1. The Dark Room. Years passed and Ethan grew up, but the fear never left him. Now an adult, Ethan was unable to leave his room, a self-imposed prison shrouded in darkness. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking out all light. The room was filled with relics from his childhood, books, toys, and old furniture, reminders of a time when shadows were just shadows. Ethan's life had become a monotonous routine. He would wake up, eat, and read, all within the confines of his room. He avoided any reflection that might show a glimpse of the shadows, fearing what he might see. His isolation was complete. He rarely spoke to anyone, even online. The world outside seemed like a distant memory, and the room had become his entire existence. Chapter 2. The Shadows Whisper. One night, Ethan began to hear faint whispers. At first, he dismissed them as figments of his imagination, the product of too many sleepless nights and his lifelong fear. But the whispers grew more distinct, more insistent. They were not words, but hisses and murmurs, like the wind rustling through leaves. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was the house settling, or the wind outside. But deep down, he knew. The whispers were coming from the shadows. They seemed to be communicating with him, a dark language that stirred something primal within him. The shadows danced at the edges of his vision, growing bolder with each passing day. Chapter 3. The Haunting Memories. Ethan couldn't shake the memories of the story his uncle told him. He began to recall every detail, every chilling word. His uncle had described the shadow creatures as sentient beings, entities that fed on fear and despair. The more Ethan thought about it, the more convinced he became that his uncle's story wasn't just a tale, but a warning. Flashbacks of his childhood came rushing back. He remembered nights spent hiding under his blankets, too scared to even peek out. He remembered the cold, creeping dread that would settle over him whenever the lights went out. The story had planted a seed of fear in him, and it had grown into a monstrous phobia that now ruled his life. Chapter 4. The Descent into Madness. The shadows in Ethan's room grew more defined, more tangible. They started to take on shapes, humanoid figures with long, grasping fingers and eyes that glowed with a malevolent light. Ethan's mind began to unravel. He could no longer tell what was real and what was a product of his fear. His paranoia intensified. He became convinced that the shadows were alive, watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ethan's physical health deteriorated. He ate less, slept sporadically, and his once sharp mind became clouded with terror. The shadows seemed to mock him, taunting him with half-formed words and eerie laughter. They knew his deepest fears, his insecurities, and they used them against him. The line between reality and nightmare blurred until Ethan could no longer distinguish one from the other. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, Ethan began rummaging through his old belongings, searching for anything that might offer an explanation. He found a letter from his uncle, tucked away in an old book. The letter revealed a dark family secret, a curse passed down through the generations. The firstborn in the family was doomed to experience the horrors of the shadow room. His uncle had been the previous victim, haunted by the same shadows that now tormented Ethan. The story he told Ethan was not just a tale, but a recounting of his own experience. He had hoped to warn Ethan, to prepare him for the inevitable. Ethan realized that he was living the same nightmare his uncle had endured. The realization was shattering, but it also gave him a grim determination. If the curse was real, then there had to be a way to break it. Chapter 6. The Shadow Room. Ethan decided to confront the shadows. He steeled himself, knowing that he might not survive the encounter but unable to continue living in fear. He turned off the few lights he kept on, plunging the room into complete darkness. The shadows closed in, their whispers turning into a cacophony of voices. Ethan demanded to know what they wanted. The shadows responded, their voices a haunting chorus. They spoke of an ancient pact, a ritual binding his family to the darkness. They revealed that the curse could only be broken by a sacrifice, one that Ethan was unwilling to make. The shadows attacked, their forms shifting and twisting, enveloping Ethan in a suffocating embrace. Ethan fought back, thrashing against the darkness, but it was no use. The room seemed to stretch infinitely, trapping him in an endless void. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows fed off his fear, growing stronger with each passing second. They were no longer just figments of his imagination. They were real, and they were hungry. Chapter 7. The Final Embrace. In his final moments, Ethan realized the true horror of the situation. The shadows were not just entities, they were the souls of those who had succumbed to the curse. His uncle was among them, a shadowy figure at the edge of his vision. The curse had claimed countless victims, each one adding to the ranks of the shadowy horde. Ethan felt the cold, creeping embrace of the shadows as they enveloped him. He could no longer see, hear, or feel anything but the crushing darkness. The last thing he heard was the echo of his own heartbeat, slowing to a stop as the shadows consumed him. The room returned to silence, the only sound the faint whispers of the shadows, now with a new voice among them. Epilogue. The cycle continues. The house stood empty for some time before a new occupant moved in. They found Ethan's room exactly as he had left it, dark and foreboding. The new tenant felt a chill as they crossed the threshold, an inexplicable sense of dread. They brushed it off as nerves, unaware of the horrors that had transpired within those walls. But soon, they too began to hear whispers in the night. The shadows seemed to move on their own, creeping closer with each passing day. The new occupant dismissed it as imagination, just as Ethan once had. The cycle was beginning again, the curse continuing its relentless march through the generations, and in the darkness, the shadows watched and waited, patient and eternal. The new occupant, a young woman named Claire, had recently moved into the house to start fresh after a difficult breakup. She was eager to leave the past behind and embrace a new chapter in her life. The house, with its affordable rent and quiet neighborhood, seemed like the perfect place to begin anew. She had heard vague rumors about its previous owner, but she dismissed them as the typical small-town gossip. However, from the moment she stepped into the house, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an oppressive atmosphere, a heaviness in the air that made her uneasy. She rationalized it as anxiety from the move and tried to ignore it. As the days passed, Claire settled into her new home. She unpacked her belongings, decorated the rooms, and tried to make the house feel warm and inviting. But despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, a chill down her spine, the feeling of eyes on her back. She often found herself glancing over her shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, only to find empty air. The strangeness escalated when she noticed the shadows in her room. They seemed darker, more defined than usual. Claire had always been a rational person, grounded in reality, but even she couldn't ignore the way the shadows seemed to stretch and move independently of any light source. At night, she would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, convinced she could hear faint whispers, like the murmur of a distant conversation. Claire began to lose sleep, her nights plagued by unsettling dreams. In these dreams, she found herself in a dark room, surrounded by shadowy figures. They whispered her name, beckoning her closer. She could never see their faces, only their glowing eyes. Every time she woke up, her heart would be pounding, her body drenched in cold sweat. The dreams felt more real than they should, leaving her disoriented and scared. She tried to tell herself it was just stress, the after effects of the move and the lingering emotions from her breakup, but the shadows continued to grow more persistent. One night, she saw a figure standing at the foot of her bed. It was tall, with long, spindly limbs and eyes that shone with an eerie light. She blinked, and the figure was gone, but the fear lingered. Subscribe to the channel to see more stories.